Like Dean, I think I'm older than he is, I've been at this for a very long time, maybe 40 or 50 years. And 40, 50 years ago, you know, I used to pray some really serious scientists, some really serious intellectuals to look into the things which we all knew were about us, but which were officially nonsense. And to quote, I will quote three people who really did it for me. Obviously, when it came to near-death experiences, lots of people, but Pim van Lommel's book, he's coming to talk to us in April. I mean, he's the doyen. You know, his book is called almost the same as Dean Radin's major book. He's talking about consciousness after life. Dean Radin's great book is, of course, The Conscious Universe. And then obviously Rupert Sheldrake in the life sciences. But when it comes to the paranormal and all those things like that, the anomalous and so on, it's Dean Radin. And when his book came out, that was 1997, that was The Conscious Universe, I thought, yes, that's it. You know, here at last, we've got someone who's nailed it. So you can imagine, I've been waiting for this talk for a long time. I don't know Dean, and now I do, and that's absolutely wonderful. And I'm sure you're going to enjoy his talk. So I'm going to hand over to you, Dean, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Let's put this there and go back over here and then share this and then start the presentation. So you should all be seeing my screen. Good. All right, so the title of the talk is The Scientific Resurrection of Magic. Resurrection means rising from the dead, but magic never died. So it's the title is not quite right. Magic has always been within us, and if you want a very nice scholarly book on this topic, it's called The Myth of Disenchantment, which is all about how what we think of as modern science today, most of it can be traced back to esoteric ideas of magic. So I would give a slightly different title, Toward a Scientific Confirmation and Understanding of Magic. So you're probably all familiar with Arthur C. Clarke and his famous third law, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. One of the ways that this is portrayed today, and this is from this guy, Oscar Miro, is that if you take traditional ideas about magic, it falls into three general categories: contact with non-physical entities, mental influence, remote perception. And the way that you would cast it in modern terms, for example, you could say, well, levitation. Well, we have airplanes, we have jetpacks, we have helicopters, or telekinesis. We have various kinds of machines that will take what you think and make it happen. And then the whole realm of remote perception, clairvoyance, these are all about television, virtual reality, and so on. So this is one way, a modern way of imagining what Arthur C. Clarke was talking about, that if you were to take an ancient person and show them any of these technologies over here, they would consider it to be identical to magic. We, of course, have an enormous amount of fictional magic, and that's not what I'm going to talk about. And we have a lot of fake magic. People like Harry Houdini, I'm not going to talk about that either. And I'm also not talking about technological magic, the ones that Arthur C. Clarke was interested in. This is a picture of a quantum computer, which even 10 years ago would have been considered a kind of magic, except now they're being built, but I'm not talking about that either. I'm talking about the real deal, about ancient ideas of esoteric magic and about the reality of that. So whenever I talk about this topic, I have to immediately remind people that these are the kinds of images that come up when we think about magic and psychic phenomena. And the reason I bring this up here is to remind you that this is not what I'm talking about either. That fiction is a reflection of reality, but of course it's an embellishment that makes it much more interesting. So the kinds of magic that we see in these kinds of stories is reflective of what I'm talking about, but of course not quite that strong. And the other thing is then magic and witches are closely related. And for some reason, these are the modern dresses of witches. I don't know why this happened. But so we're not talking about witches per se. although I mean, it's an interesting look, kind of a Gothic look, I guess, but that's not it either. It's probably closer to something which is in this direction, that there are a lot of books about ceremonial magic, high magic, sigil, witchery, that sort of thing. But probably the closest contemporary magician is Peter Carroll, who wrote this book, Liber Null, and other books, which the interesting thing about chaos magic and how Peter Carroll has portrayed these is that it's partially ancient esoteric ideas, but it's cast closer to scientific ways of thinking about the world. So when you boil it all down, it really does come down to three practices: the practice of divination, the practice of what I'll call force of will, and the practice of theurgy. So divination is seeing through space and time. Force of will is imposing your intentions into the world and influencing it. And theurgy is interacting with spirits, usually to ask them to do something on your behalf. Another way of thinking about magic is about the Grimoire. So the Grimoire is the ancient book of spells. This is a pretty famous one. And when you look at the spells and you categorize what do these magical spells do, a bunch of them are about influencing others, usually for love or sex. A bunch of it is about getting money, also about healing, and about what we can call destiny engineering or destiny guidance or destiny shaping. So all of these are actually related to the three categories I already talked about, but I'm going to cast them in this form to show you how if you kind of stand back from ceremonial magic and you look at this as a scientist, you can say, well, is there any evidence that these kinds of spells put into modern terms, do they actually work? So take, for example, influencing others. So this is the famous Jedi mind trick that Obi-Wan Kenobi would use. So when we do this in an experimental context, it's an experiment called remote influence of attention, sometimes also remote facilitation of attention. So you would have people do a task somewhat like this, where they're sitting one or maybe a couple of people, and they're asked to only pay attention to a candle flame. So they're meditating. And they're asked to also hold a button. So every time that they felt that their mind was wandering, they would press the button. And so meanwhile, you have somebody at a distance who's looking at this, usually through a closed circuit TV video stream. And the remote person is given instructions, just like Obi-Wan would be given, to help them concentrate or to distract them from concentrating. And the objective measure then is how many times do they press the button? Because if you're trying to distract them, they're going to press the button a lot because their mind's wandering. And if they're highly focused and you're trying to help them focus, they're going to press the button less. So this is an experiment that's actually been done. So this is about influencing others' behavior. So here's an article written in 2012 by a German scientist named Stefan Schmidt, who analyzed experiments looking at these distant intention effects. And these are results from the meta-analyses. The probabilities are not wildly significant, but they are significant. And the N here is the number of sessions, quite a few. So these are a lot of sessions involved. So in each of the three different kinds, this one, the DMILS is remote physiological influence. It means distant mental interactions with living systems, but it's all about remote physiology, remote staring, the feeling of being stared at. And this one is the Obi-Wan Kenobi mental influence of behavior. So all of them show effects under very strictly controlled conditions in a laboratory. So can we influence others through behavior and physiology? The answer is yes. So at least those kinds of spells have some confirmation in modern scientific terms. Well, what about making money? So I'm going to skip over exactly how the associative remote viewing protocol works. But the idea is that you can use clairvoyance and cast it into a form where you can use that information to make stock picks, whether stock is going to go up or down. And Greg did 13 years of experiments with 5,677 sessions And the bottom line was that 60% of his trades were profitable, where you'd expect 50% to be by chance. So he actually made a fair amount of money. It took 13 years to make the $146,000. So this is not the sort of thing you wanted to make a fast buck, but he was able to make money on this. And Dick Bierman, a colleague at the University of Amsterdam, did a meta-analysis showing that of 17 experiments using the same method as Greg did, that the overall scoring rate or hit rate was around 63%, where again, 50% would be chance. So can you make money using psychic means in this case? And the answer is yes. Again, supporting from a scientific perspective that the idea of spells, spell casting to make money, at least in this form, yeah, you can do it. You're not going to probably make a huge amount of money, but you can make some. So yeah, you can make money. Well, what about healing? A large number of spells are about healing yourself and others. So here's an example of an experiment that we did last year, where we tested what the euphemism is biofield therapies, but these are all various kinds of spiritual and psychic healing methods. So we found people who were experts at each one of these different kinds of 17 healing methods. And we had 190 people come to the laboratory, each one of which had carpal tunnel pain. And so each of the healers worked with around 10 people. What we did is we took a whole bunch of measures before the session. They did a single healing session of 30 minutes, and then we took a whole bunch of measures afterwards. And then 3 weeks later, we did a follow-up to see whether the energy medicine or biofield or psychic healing methods would actually work in resolving pain for carpal tunnel. And so we're targeting carpal tunnel mainly because it's not so horrendous that the patients would not be allowed to come to the lab. We needed people to come into the lab for this. And also it's fairly common. So we were able to get almost 200 people to come to the lab one at a time. So we did this inside our shielded room. This is an electromagnetically shielded room. Weighs, in terms of kilograms, something like 1,700 kilograms, solid steel, double walled. This is the inside. So the patient would sit in this chair. The healer would sit in this chair. Sometimes they also stood while they're doing their healing. There's no contact at any time. They're able to get close, but they're not able to contact the patient. And then in this chair, we had a person who we called the seer, who was a clairvoyant who was claimed to be able to see energy passing between the healer and the patient. We had the same healer for all 190 sessions, or sorry, the same seer for all of the 190 sessions. And the seer was asked to write in a diary everything that she saw. So we have a large qualitative database, at least from one clairvoyant, of what was going on in the room. And of course, we also had the primary measure was pain relief. And it's hard to see here, but these are error bars around these little dots because they're very tight error bars. So these are highly confident little points here. This is the mean level of pain from a scale of 0 to 10 before the healing, after the 30 minutes of healing, and 3 weeks later. So this is monstrously significant. So if this were chance, these would all be on the same line. So it is clearly not chance. And more importantly, that their level of pain significantly decreased. And it stayed decreased even 3 weeks later. So this is interesting. This is a single half-hour session of psychic healers doing their thing in terms of wrist pain. So it made a significant difference. We took many other measures on this as well, in both objective and subjective measures in these sessions, but I'm just pointing out that the primary measure is pain relief. Some years earlier, I did an experiment involving voodoo. In the voodoo, we used an actual doll. We had people put things on the doll that made it like themselves, like a little picture, a little piece of hair, things like that. So they customized the voodoo doll. And then from a distance, we'd have a healer work on the doll, and we would see whether or not the physiology of the person at the distance would change. And the answer is it changed a lot. This is electrodermal activity. This is blood volume pulse, which is a correlate of blood pressure, and this is heart rate. So the thing that didn't change too much is heart rate, a little bit here, but in terms of blood pressure or the BVP measure, very large changes in blood pressure, very large changes in electrodermal activity as well. And so these are in 1 minute or 60-second periods separated by periods where there was no influence. So this is looking at the difference between the influence and non-influence periods, where the healer is actually interacting with a effigy or a voodoo doll, and we saw a very large effect. So do the healing spells work cast into the laboratory? The answer is yes. So then we have this whole area about destiny, shaping destiny. So there's two ways of thinking about it. One is that through divining the future, you can guide your destiny. And the other one is you can shape your destiny by manipulating reality itself. And you can find lots and lots of spells that are about this. So in terms of divination, what we do in the laboratory is experiments on perception through space. And these are classic remote viewing experiments. So in one form of remote viewing, you simply ask somebody to describe where your friend is now. And the friend could be anywhere within around a 30-minute radius of where you can drive. So these are classic experiments done already 40 years ago. So here's an example of what somebody actually said. So the remote viewer is, in this case, in a classified environment as part of the Stargate program that was part of back in the 1980s. And so the remote viewer in this case is in the classified environment inside something called a skiff, which is a special compartmented shielded room where nothing can get in and nothing can get out. They're put in there for this purpose. Nevertheless, the remote viewer came up with a sketch of where she thought, in this case it's her, where her friend was. So she wrote words very open and very airy, lots of poles and construction, something like a fence, like looking at something that narrows, quiet and solitude, and a bunch of other things, and that's the sketch. So what the remote viewer did not know is that there were 4 possible places where we could have sent her friend. So these are the pictures of what those places look like. A random decision was made, and so the random decision was to send the friend to this location. The friend went there, took a bunch of pictures, walked around, experienced what it was like. And then we got a judge to look at the sketch of what the remote viewer said and say, well, one of these 4 places where a friend went. So your job is to take the sketch and the words and so on, and to try to guess which one of these 4 places you think the friend actually was at. So in this case, the chance of being correct by chance is 1 in 4, and the judge would have selected this one because it both visually looked right and the description of it seemed more correct for that kind of a place than these other places. So it comes down to quite a long experiment. It could take about 90 minutes to do the experiment and come down to a single data point of hit or miss. So this would have been a hit. So when you look at the representative tests that were done over 20 years or so, SRI is Stanford Research Institute was the name at that time. They did lots of sessions in an experimental form, and the probability is far against chance. Later repeated at Science Applications International, which is another defense contractor. Another couple hundred sessions, again, very strong result. And then a few years later at Princeton University, they did essentially the same experiment and again was able to get highly significant results. So these are all published and are already rather old now. So we know that this has been around a long time. What's more interesting and probably less known to people is that the Stargate program had a research component of which I was a member of, but there was also a pragmatic component. And that was to see if you could use clairvoyance for espionage. So this was the remote viewing spying unit at Fort Meade, Maryland. And this was a summary then of the missions that were done for the Army, for the CIA, for the Defense Intelligence, the FBI, and so on, for all the different agencies. And what this shows is that The Army and the CIA and the DIA and the Joint Task Force, the National Security Agency, US Coast Guard, and a number of other places came back repeatedly. 450 missions, came back, which involved 2,700 actual remote viewing sessions. And so this is a way of saying, well, these are not simply probabilities against chance, but these are agencies that were using these remote viewings to get information about things that nobody within the US knew about. So they were pragmatically useful for actual operational missions, and they kept coming back for more. So that suggests that whatever we're giving them was actually useful. So these are the two books I recommend if you want to know in detail what's going on in the Stargate program. We learned after the program ended, we suspected during the program, but we learned afterwards that Russia was doing the same thing. So this book tells about the psychic wars between the US and Russia that were happening at the same time as told by people on both sides. And this volume is one of 4 volumes, big books that are the reports of the research, the behind the scenes politics, all kinds of stuff related to the 20 years or so of the Stargate program. I would say that most of that program has been declassified and is reported in these books. Little bits of it are still classified. What about perception through time? So one of the ways of looking at that is a method that I developed called presentiment. You record physiology, in this case it happens to be EEG and electrodermal and a few other things. You just record it continually. And then you make a random decision to show either a calm picture or an emotional picture. And since you're measuring the physiology continually, you can see whether or not people would begin to respond emotionally before an emotional picture and remain calm before a calm picture. And this would be an unconscious form of precognition. So here's an example. This is using skin conductance. And this is the average of the skin conductance before a calm picture, which is shown at this point. And this is the skin conductance before seeing an emotional picture, which again is not only shown at this point in the graph, but it is selected at this point. So these curves do not represent images that were already known in advance by somebody. Nobody knew before that stimulus appeared what the picture would actually be. So this difference then, statistical difference, is what I call the presentiment response, because it shows that in this case, up to 6 seconds before the image was selected and shown, the people were already showing a physiological difference. We did this in many different kinds of contexts. This one happens to be pupil dilation. So the lady is looking at a picture and we can see where she's looking, and also we can measure the size of her pupil, and we see a very significant effect again, that when you're about to see an emotional picture, your pupil begins to dilate more than if you're about to see a calm picture. So this was a highly statistically significant difference. So a colleague of mine, 2012, did a meta-analysis of all of the studies using this method. She called it predictive physiological anticipation. Highly significant result, indicating that on this point to around 36 replications, that this was not just something I was seeing in my lab, but labs around the world were seeing similar effects. I put this here because this is a scientific article, and most scientific articles, if you're lucky, have been seen a few hundred times. This one was seen well over 110,000 times now, which is more than 99% of articles that appear in this Frontier series. So sometimes you'll hear from skeptics that nobody's interested in this stuff. That is not borne out by the evidence, which shows that a huge number of people, mostly scientists, are retrieving these articles and looking at them. So there's a lot of interest. So is there evidence for divination? Yes. What about reality manipulation or force of will? So the idea of mind-matter interaction has been tested in many ways. The one that's been tested the most is, can we mentally affect probabilistic systems? So many studies, almost 50 years of studies using the tossing of dice. And they did a meta-analysis and that showed, yeah, it seemed to work. But in the last 50 years, mostly we're using random number generators, which are the equivalent of tossing dice, except doing it electronically and using a source of randomness that we trace down to the quantum scale. So it's thought to be fundamentally random. So this is a random number generator that was custom built at Princeton University in the mid 80s and 90s. It was used mostly. Today, you can buy one that is just as good as the device that was built back then called True RNG, and it's in like a little memory stick, and it's quite good. It produces random bits just like the old version did. And at Princeton, they did the same experiment for 12 years with lots of people, and did an experiment where the random bits are being produced. And you ask somebody while it's being produced to look at a screen with a squiggly line and say, mentally make there be more 1 bits, more ones coming out of this. And when you look at the number of trials, in this case, 250,000 trials, a lot of people involved, and the instruction was to aim high, meaning more 1 bits, probabilities were adjusted in some way, and that's what the device did. And likewise, when the instruction was to aim low, then the probabilities somehow got changed and you got a systematic effect going low. And baseline is where you're told not to try to influence it. So this is a highly significant difference. When people or scientists were told about this through publications, it made almost no effect in the scientific world at all, mainly because people didn't believe it. So while I was at Princeton with a colleague, Roger Nelson, we did a meta-analysis to find out, has anyone else ever been able to replicate this? We found more than 800 relevant experiments. And then the bottom line was unequivocal positive effects in the experimental conditions and chance results in control conditions. So Foundations of Physics is a very mainstream journal, and we were kind of pleased, surprised they published this. This article has been cited many, many times, but you would not know that by the way that most physicists today respond to this. They still think it's impossible, but they nevertheless read the articles. So a huge range of different kinds of studies looking at the role of intention in the behavior of the physical world. So just one other that I'll point to here, which is about influencing growth of plants. So we use this plant, Arabidopsis Thaliana. We used it because it's easy to grow. It's a model plant that's used in plant physiology studies. Its genome was fully sequenced before the human genome. So a lot is known about this plant and is useful because the plant can have certain diseases which are analogs of human diseases. So it's easier to study genetic problems in plants than it is in humans, and that's one of the reasons why this plant is studied so often. So we did this in Taiwan. My colleague there is the one who actually ran it in Taiwan, and it's at a Buddhist temple where we recruited all the people. And the task was to ask the 3 senior members of the Buddhist temple to bless water, which should be used to hydrate the seeds of this plant. So we had both blessed water, and the water was blessed so that it would make the plants grow better. And there was also identical water from the same source that was the control, which was not blessed. So whenever you do this kind of experiment where you have an influence and you have a control, you have to be careful not to accidentally have the blessing work on this water too. So we had both a blessing and we had an anti-blessing. So the blessing was directed at these bottles of water, and then we had an anti-blessing directed at the other bottles so that in case they were accidentally blessed, they would be unblessed. This is the kind of hoops you have to jump through sometimes when you're doing studies with intention, because we don't actually know the extent to which things are being influenced. So we had both positive and control blessing of water. There's my colleague. His name is Yongyong Xia in Taiwan. So the seeds then were given to a plant physiologist whose only job under double-blind conditions was to grow the seeds. They also got water medium A and water medium B, one of which was blessed and the other was not. Identically grew different strains of genetic mutations. So Col4 is the wild type seed for this type of plant. Cry1-2 and his Cry2 are 2 types of mutations of the plants. And we were mainly interested in this one called HisCry2. This is a type of mutation of the plant that makes it over-respond to blue light. And when you grow these plants in the laboratory, they're inside an incubator, typically under blue light. So we expected that if there was going to be any effect here, that it might show up more in a plant that was responding faster to growing. That's what this mutation does. So the measurements of interest, we took a bunch of measurements, but the main one was called, after growing these two, was something called a hypocotyl. So the hypocotyl is the distance from the top of the roots of the plant to the bottom of the first leaves. And so when you have a strong, healthy plant, you have a short, fat hypocotyl. We're interested in the length of it. The reason why it's short and fat is because the roots are doing really well. They're bringing a lot of nutrients up to the leaves, and the leaves have opened quickly. So a lot of the energy that was stored in the seed is sustained, and it's being used only for growing the plants. And so you only have a short, fat hypocotyl. If you plant it too deep, or it's not a very healthy seed, you'll end up with a long, skinny hypocotyl, meaning it's not a very healthy plant. So the bottom line is, for this HisCry2 mutation of Arabidopsis, the treated hypocotyl was smaller, shorter, and fatter than the control water. And so these are 95% error bars. So there's no doubt at all that the treated plants did a lot better in terms of growth. So the probability is 10 to the minus 14th here of the distance between these two. So as I said, there have been many other experiments using everything from photons to random events and water and food and wine, plants, cells, animals, human health, human behavior, the whole range, looking at, do these kinds of physical systems change for inanimate and animate systems when you have somebody intending at them? The answer is, in most cases, yes. So there does seem to be some form of ability to manipulate physical reality. So then we come to witches. So with witches, the idea is that some people have psychic talent. And the folklore is that it seems to run in families. If that's true, then it means there's probably a genetic basis. So when I was at the University of Edinburgh back in mid-90s, one of my colleagues there ran a study on Scottish second sight, which is one of the folklores that you find in many cultures. And second sight is generally, the mythology is that it runs in families. And so she did a hereditability test where she went to families who claimed this and then said, well, is anybody else in the family who has this? In most cases, people would say, yeah, my grandmother had this ability, or my mother, usually on the mother's side of the family, that there's something that seems to come down. So while that did show an interesting possibility of inheriting this ability, it still didn't separate the nature versus nurture issue. Because if you grow up in a family where everybody is supportive of these things, it's more likely people are going to report it. That would be the nurture part, but it still doesn't actually say that it's a genetic component. So at the time, in the mid-90s, we didn't have ways of running the human genome, but now we do. So we did a study, started a couple of years ago, where we recruited by the internet 3,000 candidates worldwide, all of whom we were asking, do you think you're psychic, and do you have other people in your family who you think are psychic too? So we started with that, and we did a long series. It took months to go through all these people to vet 13 people who actually had some psychic ability that we were able to test, who did in fact come from families of psychics. And we were able to match them. We actually matched against 13, but we didn't get the DNA of 3 of them. So we have matched controls of the same age and gender and race who didn't report anything psychic, and nobody in their families reported anything psychic. So this is what you do when you're doing a genetic test to see if you can detect something different genetically between 2 kinds of people. It's called a case control study. So we got the DNA, we ran the full genomes on them. We found no differences in the exome. So when you run the DNA has 2 major parts to it. The exome is the part of the DNA that codes for proteins. And so the human body is made up of proteins. So it was thought for a long time that there's only a portion, a small portion of the DNA that codes for proteins, and all of the rest of it, nobody had any idea what it did. It was called junk DNA because nobody knew. Well, it turns out now we're a little older and wiser, and we realize that the rest of the DNA is extremely important, not just the exome. In fact, if you only look at the exome, we have the same number, approximately the same number of genes as a banana. And clearly, we're a little bit smarter than a banana. So it was something else. Well, the something else is this junk DNA, which is the very, the important part, which is able to express how proteins are built and what they do with each other and how they interact and lots of other things. So we're beginning to learn that. But the important point for this study was no differences in the exome. So there's not a direct protein effect. But we did find a difference in the intron sequence. So the exome, if you look at the DNA, you find spots on it that are coding for proteins, but there are little spacers between those areas, and the spacers are called the intron. The intron sequence is much more closely associated now with epigenetics. It's switches, these are switches that turn genes on and off. Well, we found in this particular gene on chromosome 7, a significant difference, actually not statistically significant, but a notable difference between the psychics and the non-psychics. And more interestingly, or actually as a secondary effect, it turns out that there's this whole domain called sociogenetics, which is looking at the genetics of an entire population. And you can see differences in genetics and populations. And we found that this particular gene, that particular chromosome, is correlated with the duration of contact with the cultural idea of Christianity. And it's negatively correlated. And so what this means is that this particular gene is not found in cultures that have had a long duration of contact with Christianity. We thought, well, what in the world does that mean? And then we realized it's about witch burning. So for hundreds of years in cultures that have been in close contact with Christianity, anything having to do with witches was considered demonic and people were killed. And so if you look then at what happens from a sociological perspective, it was reducing the ability to have this particular gene in those cultures. So this, we didn't expect to find this. I mean, we didn't know beforehand because no one had ever done this before. But it's an interesting finding because it kind of suggests that on a very large scale, over hundreds of years, there was a kind of a genetic engineering going on by getting rid of people who had at least were from the outside, were seen as having the capabilities that witches are associated with. Now, clearly, in a lot of cases of the witch burning, it had nothing to do with psychic ability, but in enough cases, it probably did. And that's why we find this significant. This is actually a significant correlation here. So it produced a selection pressure to reduce that sequence. Maybe it's about the Inquisition or witch burning. We don't know at this point. So the next step in this whole genetic sequence now, we're within probably a couple of weeks of publishing a paper which reports all of this. So this is hot off the press, this finding. We're now looking to raise money to run thousands of people in both the psychics and the match controls because you need that level of statistics in order to really see a difference. At this point, our suspicion is that it's not just this one intron sequence. There probably are other markers, biomarkers of psychic talent. And I say this because we know from colleagues who have been looking at brain morphology that the brains of people who report psychic type events are not the same as brains of people who don't report it. There are structural differences. And when you find a structural difference in a brain that is not a lesion, it suggests that there's a genetic reason for it. So that's what we think we're going to find when we do the larger scale study, which, by the way, costs millions of dollars. So if anybody has a couple of spare millions of dollars and would like to help us on this, we'd be very happy to talk to you about it. So in terms of the evidence, it's pretty clear that something like magic works. We would call it something different today, different words, but the techniques work. When we start asking questions about how does it work, we immediately bump up against our worldview. So the worldview, the scientific worldview today, we can think of it as like this, that technologies are the practical application of today's scientific worldview. Whereas magic was the practical application of the esoteric worldview. It's really that simple. The worldview today is materialism, which assumes that everything is made out of matter and energy, it's physics. And from physics emerges chemistry and then biology and psychology, and somehow magically in ways that nobody understands, we are aware. So awareness, consciousness arises out of this physical substrate. This is why some philosophers come up with the idea that since it's emerging out of physical, the purely physical world, that consciousness is kind of an epiphenomenon. It's like an illusion. Like we have the illusion that zombies are aware, but they're dead. So they're probably not aware. So this is where the term zombies comes from that philosophers have used. So from this perspective, psychic stuff, magic stuff is impossible. It cannot work. This is one in mainstream science today that is based on materialism. They don't pay much attention to these things because they obviously can't work. And it is also true, though, that the doctrine of materialism has been extremely successful. It's allowing us to do this interview where I'm thousands of miles away from all you folks, and there are people from probably around the world who are watching this live through methods that were developed purely through materialism. If you took an indigenous society that was much more spiritual, they would not have developed this. So we cannot throw away what we've developed. But on the other hand, psychic things do exist, as we see through scientific methods based on materialism. So something's missing. So where do we look for some answers? Well, one place to look is in the esoteric literature. You can go all the way back to shamanism, and you can come up later and find new ways of thinking about these things called Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, the Kabbalah, alchemy, Gnosticism, and then in the East, yoga, the Vedas, Buddhism, and so on. So Aldous Huxley did a very nice synthesis of this perennial philosophy and basically said all of them in their own way are saying something like this: consciousness is fundamental. A philosopher would say, oh, okay, that means you're talking about idealism. Idealism is consciousness is fundamental. Well, idealism is the flip side of materialism. So here's idealism. You notice that all of the pyramid looks exactly the way it did before, except we do this. So we now simply assume that consciousness does not miraculously appear out of nothing. It's actually here and prior to physics. That's what the esoteric traditions are all basically saying, that somehow physics and the physical world arises out of consciousness. And then all the rest of it is the same. Well, this is important to think of it in this term because what it does is it says materialism is still the same as it was before. We don't throw away our textbooks, but it casts it now into terms where it is a special case of a constrained way of viewing reality. Works really well within there. But if you need a more expansive way of understanding reality, which includes consciousness, you need a larger way of thinking about things. So that's the form of idealism that I'm talking about. It's an expansion of materialism where materialism is seen as a special case. So under this condition, now suddenly psychic things are accepted and rather easy to understand. So here's materialism. This larger pyramid now is something like idealism or neutral monism. There are lots of words that can be used, but it keeps materialism just as healthy as it was before with a new assumption that encompasses all of them. And this is not unusual in science. I mean, the world of classical physics works in a certain domain. There's a whole bunch of things that we've learned and we can do with classical physics. Classical physics does not help you understand relativity. The world is very large or very high gravity, and nor does it help you with quantum physics. The world is very small and very fast and that sort of thing. So these are different domains that have different ways of understanding what's going on. Philosophy has dealt with this for a long time. There's a huge chasm of ignorance. In fact, I would say that the actual picture here would show that classical physics, relativity, and quantum mechanics are little tiny things. The chasm of ignorance is gigantic compared to what is left to be known. It's huge, but it doesn't fit in this chart so good. And then there's the future where there's all kinds of things we're beginning to study. This very nice map was made by this guy, Dominic Welleman. So you can look at the edge of science today. This is from the MIT Technology Review, talking about an experiment suggesting there's no such thing as objective reality. Two observers can experience different conflicting realities. Well, kind of suggesting that somehow the observation, the consciousness, is wrapped into a physical world in some very intimate way. And likewise in Scientific American, not particularly known as being radical, it's coming to grips with the implications of quantum mechanics, a primary role for mind and nature. So you see these kinds of ideas now that are beginning to show up in the academic press. And that's an important indicator because the academic press essentially is the leading edge on mainstream science. So you see mainstream physicists talking about the nature of reality as information, nature of reality as quantum information, as mathematics, and even within mainstream neuroscience today, you take someone like Christoph Koch saying, I believe consciousness is a fundamental and elementary property of living matter. It can't be derived from anything else. Well, that's idealism. I mean, they may not be thinking of it in those philosophical terms, but nevertheless, there's the leading edge. It's beginning to point more and more towards what we would normally think of as an esoteric worldview. So we can make a new grimoire, Grimoire for the Green Witch Scientist. I'll put my name on there because I'm able to do that. So can we influence others, as we say in the spells? Yeah, there's some evidence we can do that. We can make money, we can heal, we can shape destiny. So basically what we're looking at here is that all this lore, ancient esoteric lore, enormous amounts of it is superstitious, but the core of it, about the nature of consciousness and its role in the physical world, I think you're going to see a straight line that is pointing into the future of science. And so my book, Real Magic, is kind of a bridge between the two. I see more and more evidence that consciousness is being taken more seriously within physics and with other neurosciences. And you can see this very clearly by the number of conferences, the number of books, the number of articles, and the number of journals that are devoted now to these topics. It has exploded in the last 20 years or so. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we'll have plenty of time for questions, which I'll be very happy to try to answer.
Well, Dean, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. So neat. And it just shows you just got to live long enough and some of the answers do come around the corner.
Yeah, old ideas start to become new again.
And of course, I can't resist saying that on this very series of talks, we've had Philip Goff, we've had Rupert Sheldrake, and we've had others. Bernardo Kastrup is coming. People for whom consciousness, well, you hear his name was on one of the books you just put up, for whom consciousness is in some sense primary. I mean, these are philosophers and people who are not in some mainstream scientists. I mean, it's as if there's a bit of a consensus almost building here, not to eliminate the materialist view, but to supplement it with this radical idealism, which of course goes back to Plato.
Right. So this is not mainstream by any means. When we publish studies where we're talking, I mean, I don't talk about magic when I write a scientific paper because I would guarantee it would never show up anywhere. But we're talking about phenomena that could be studied in the laboratory, and you try to publish it in mainstream journals. If you get past the first stage, where they don't just reject it out of hand, which happened, that's usually what happens.
Yeah.
Then if you're lucky, it will be reviewed. And if you're really lucky, you'll get a review back in maybe 3 or 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. And then with even more luck, you get people who will say, okay, make these 350 adjustments to the paper, and then we'll publish it. So fortunately, this is happening now. So you're seeing more and more journals and more mainstream outlets that are allowing the idea that consciousness is fundamental and it can do things, right? So it's not simply like a philosophical discussion about idealism, but it actually, the consciousness is a thing that is active in some way. And so that is still very radical. And while many scientists I know who are quite conservative will privately admit enormous interest, they're not ready to be public about it yet. It's just, it pushes too far. But I think in a generation or two, we'll find more and more younger people who are not concerned so much about their academic standing, who will be increasingly more open to at least discussing these kinds of things without fear of losing their tenure or their position.
Well, that's absolutely great. I'm going to go to some of the chat questions now, but before I do, just to support what you said, these philosophers, of course, simply say about consciousness that it's the only thing of which we're absolutely certain. I mean, that gives it a bit of clout, doesn't it?
Everything else is an inference.
Exactly. Well, we have Graham Kidd here, who of course makes it a nice, easy one for you, Dean. He says, could you please define consciousness? And while you're at it, what is energy? I think it's a joke question, but I'll bowl it at you anyway.
Yeah, so consciousness is for me a synonym for awareness, self-awareness and awareness of others. Energy, I have no idea what energy is. So my first 2 degrees are in electrical engineering. It's all about use of electrons. And then I would occasionally ask my professors, what exactly is an electron? Like, what is a charge? Don't ask that question, because we don't know what that is. It's like it's a given, it's a thing. But if you're really looking at fundamental questions about what it is, we don't know what it is.
Okay.
So you fall back then on the standard answers. Well, energy is related to force, which is related to ability to change things. I mean, that's about the best we can get, because when you go to the dictionary, you start getting circular definitions very quickly.
Well, good one. Robert Steck comes in with something which is close to our hearts. Could you spend any time relating about what you've been saying to research on mediumship? You know, people who channel the dead.
Yeah. So mediumship, it falls into at least the magical category of theurgy, because it's about communing with spirits and the dead. We're doing studies like that at the institute where I work, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. There's a number of other people around the world doing these studies. It was very popular, of course, in the late 1800s with the Society for Psychical Research, and then nothing happened for a long time. It went dark for many years, and so it only resurrected within the past 20 years or so that there are laboratory studies of mediums. And the methods that are used now are different, I think somewhat better than they were 100 years ago, where what they can tell us then is under double and triple and sometimes 4 and 5 levels of blindedness, the mediums can get verifiably correct information from the sitters. We don't know how they get it. We don't even know that they're necessarily getting it from dead people, right? The old problem that was known 100 years ago was maybe it's telepathy, maybe it's clairvoyance, maybe there's a whole bunch of maybes under there. So we know that the information is correct, and it was not obtained through surreptitious, mundane reasons, but we still are struggling with the idea of where does that information come from. So we've stopped doing experiments looking at the verification question, and instead are looking more at questions about brain processing. Like, are there differences in the brain of a medium when they're doing mediumship as compared to imagining that they're doing mediumship? And the answer is yes, there's a difference. This still doesn't tell us what's going on, but it at least provides another layer saying whatever the medium is doing when they're getting the information, it's not like normal sensory processing or imagination or listening to a story, it's something else. So these all provide clues as to maybe giving us guidance as to what is actually happening. I also suspect that among mediums as a group, that there's a genetic difference between them and people who are not able to do that. But again, we need millions of dollars in order to do these kinds of genetic studies. So,
well, I'll see what I've got in my bank account.
yeah, we'll take $1 from each of a million people or something like that.
Peter Bruin asks, have you suffered, Dean, from the kind of TEDx deplatforming, no platforming that Rupert Sheldrake and others have experienced?
Things like that have happened to me, but I don't really regard it as suffering. If you're interested in studying fire and you're afraid of getting burned occasionally, you should be studying something else. So it's something about my personality is compelled by the curiosity of these phenomena. So that's why I study it. Uh, and I can't say that I don't care at all about what other people think, but it's not number one on my list. So I'm being pulled by curiosity, which is more important to me than what other people think.
Good, good. A man called Richard Raffles asked the question, what are your suggestions for best practice in utilizing magic in practical, tangible impacts in our own personal lives? Do you think we can really use it in any way?
Well, I think we do. We all do in one way or another. But this is where it go back into what Peter Carroll was suggesting back when he first wrote his books in the 1970s, I think, that to do magic effectively, you need to have a pretty good control of your mind, because you need to be in the state of gnosis in order for anything to happen. Or if you prefer yoga, you need to be in a state of samadhi, the same thing. So having a meditative practice or a ritual practice or something that will help focus the mind and exclude all of the things you don't need to think about, that's part of it. The other part, though, is you need to keep a pretty good journal to find out what works for you and what doesn't. Because all kinds of things we know this just from doing tests with psychic phenomena, that you will have somebody come into the lab and do something fabulously amazing one day, and then they'll come back the next day and they can't do anything. Well, why? Well, we're highly variable dynamic systems. So maybe they ate something that interfered, or maybe there was something happening in the world that did an effect, or the sun was in the wrong place or something like that. So having a journal which is kept over long periods of time would help somebody who's trying to practically use magical methods to tell them what works for them and what doesn't work. And so this just as a practice makes a lot of sense to me. So the combination of something like meditation, something like keeping track of what works, eventually pay attention to all of that and you'll get better at it up to some level of natural ability. So people oftentimes will say, I want to become Harry Potter, or I want to become the next super psychic. Everybody could learn to play tennis a little bit or play golf a little bit. You can learn the rules and learn ways of getting better. Everyone will plateau to their level of natural ability. So somebody who comes in with a talent for psychic or magical practice will get very good very quickly. They're going to plateau too, but they might plateau at a level that is really spectacular. Most of us don't have that talent. I can play golf, but you're never going to see me play a competition. And I can play tennis, but I will injure myself within 10 minutes, so I'll stop doing that. So in each case, it's we think maybe we'll be able to create genetic markers. So just like you can give your genetics over to a company now and say, well, you have a tendency to have this kind of illness, and you probably want to avoid asparagus and that sort of thing. We might be able to eventually develop something as well that says, you actually do have a psychic talent. You'd probably be best for something like perceptual effects, like clairvoyance. But it doesn't look like you're going to have the capacity to be able to do any kind of psychokinetic work. So I can imagine that will be possible at some point. We're not there yet, obviously, but can we go in that direction? The combination of genetics and history and questionnaires we give people, I can see that you could do that. So then it would be useful, because if somebody was a fledgling magician and they found out, well, you'd be really good in this direction, well, do that. Don't spend all of your time trying to do something else that you're basically not going to be able to do very well.
Thank you, yes. Jenny Jimson's got a question about, is there a fine line between a power of belief, like the fear of voodoo, I believe this thing is going to happen to me on the one hand, and genuine energy healing through intention on the other? They look as if they're slightly different things.
Yes. So any decent laboratory test for energy healing, for psychic ability, for any of these things has to be done under controlled conditions where you're able to exclude a placebo or expectation effect. So in the case of the study that I reported that we did not have a control condition because it costs money to have a control condition. And in addition, if you're doing psychic or energy type healing and the healer is near you, in order to have a control condition to control for expectation, you need a sham healer. Because when we ask healers in the presence of somebody who is in need of some kind of healing to not heal, most of them say they can't do it. they are naturally going to heal. So you need somebody who is a sham healer, someone who seems like a healer, but actually has no ability at all that they know of, who will come in and play the role of a healer. So that means we're dealing with actors now. So we dealt with 190 people, and so we'd need to have a double the size of our experiment with another 190 people who are being treated by actors, and we didn't have the amount of the money to do that. So what we were able to do is ask each person before the healing session, what is your belief about whether this is going to work? And what is your expectation about what's going to happen? So that's how we were getting at the placebo effect. And if we found that there was a strong correlation between expectation and the outcome, well, then we'd say, okay, well, it was just a placebo effect. But the fact is we did not see that. We had people who came in very skeptical that this was going to do anything because they had been dealing with chronic wrist pain for years, and it still worked. So even though this wasn't done in the way which we would rather have had with true control condition, it still worked, even with the kind of secondary control that we're able to look at in terms of expectation. So I think one of the other studies we did, which I didn't talk about, was we did a study where we had the Buddhist monks in Taiwan bless tea and oolong tea in Taiwan. And then we had the blessed tea, we had the unblessed tea, we gave it to 200 people, 100 got one type and 100 got the other type, and they didn't know what they got. So again, we found that the blessed tea, people's mood improved because that was the blessing, your mood would improve. But we also asked people about their expectation. Did you think you were getting the blessed tea, or did you think you were not getting it? And what do you think about the blessings? All of those kinds of questions to get at even more than simply having a control tea. And we found that for people who did not think that they were getting the blessed tea, their expectation was, I don't think this is blessed, they didn't show any effect at all. They had no effect. By contrast, if you thought you were getting the blessed tea, and in fact, you got the blessed tea, there was a monstrous effect. It was about 1,000% increase or improvement in mood, huge effect. So that was in a combination of expectation and the actual blessing. But you can completely eradicate that if you have people who got the blessed tea and didn't believe it. So there's no question that belief and expectation even modulate these, quote, magical effects.
True magical effect. In a slightly voyeuristic way, a couple of people would like to know what it was like working with the Stargate stars like McMonagall and the others. I mean, what can you share with us about those guys?
Well, it was my first exposure to people who were exceptionally talented. I didn't know, I mean, my image at that point of what a psychic would look like was more like the stereotype of Madame Zodiac. And yet these are all army guys, you know, like the person you would never, ever guess had these abilities. And the other thing that I found interesting was not only in an experimental context were they quite good, but they would give useful information for operational missions. I mean, people are going out in danger and using this information along with lots of other information and finding it to be useful. So I had no idea that there were people out there who had that level of skill. The other thing that was interesting is I kind of imagined that somebody would have to go into an altered state of awareness and meditate for 12 hours and something. But these folks were able to do almost as accurate remote viewing while driving a car or having breakfast in a diner as they would when they were doing their thing as part of work. So there's some, for them at least, some very minor switch happened in their mind where they're able to turn it on, turn it off, and it was no big deal. So that's what you then see at these levels of very high talent. So to put it a slightly different way, you can take the best tennis player in the world on their very worst day. They have the flu really, really bad, and they haven't slept, and they just feel horrible. They will still beat the pants off of you because when you're dealing with levels of very high natural talent, it is so far beyond. It's like I'm going to have a race with somebody who's an Olympic track record person, and I mean, it's just astonishing what the range of human abilities are.
Of course. Well, talking of that sort of thing, John Sprunt has asked us, what happens when you have materialists participating in experiments, which sounds like a good thing, would they have a negative, or do they have a negative influence on the outcome of the experiment? Skeptics.
Well, I think a lot of people are materialists, but they don't even think of it in those terms, right? I mean, a philosophical materialist, somebody who strongly buys into all there is energy, they can still come up with a reason to believe that this might work. So I skipped over a whole section here, which is quasi-material, which has to do with the quantum brain, right? So before quantum mechanics, we didn't have any way of thinking about this at all. With quantum mechanics and entanglement in particular, we have quasi-physical ways of thinking about how psychic phenomena can work. And so you can be a hardcore materialist, a physicist, and understand that eventually, as we learn more and more about quantum biology, that some aspects of the brain are probably operating in a quantum fashion, which means some aspects of the brain which are non-local, and psychic phenomena are basically all about non-local connections between things. So you can make up a narrative that would seem plausible and may in fact be plausible, which is material in the sense that it's standard physics now, but it's not material in the sense that we're dealing with acausal connections that don't involve energy or apparently anything else. So this is why within quantum mechanics today, there's very little consensus about how to interpret what it means. Some would go as far as saying that it's not physical at all. It's all completely informational. And others would say, well, no, I'm not ready to give up energy yet. But nevertheless, it could provide an explanation in material terms, quasi-material. So just because of the philosophy that one holds, it's not necessarily the issue. I think what you're talking about there in that question is, if somebody simply does not believe, they strongly disbelieve for whatever reason that these things are possible, they will either get a negative result, and sometimes significantly negative, because that will confirm their belief, but usually only if they're statistically naive. So if you describe the sheep experiment where you can simply take a classroom of students, you separate them according to the belief in ESP, you give them exactly the same ESP card test, and they will predictably split according to their belief. So the sheep, the believers, will get a significant positive effect, and the goats, the disbelievers, will typically get either a null or significantly negative effect. So belief does modulate this.
Yes, of course. A rather neat question here, but I think you answered it a moment ago. Which field allows you to mix physics with your type of experimentation? The answer is quantum mechanics.
Yes.
Essentially, you did cover that. Anything to say about exoplanets and extraterrestrials, Dean? That comes from Charles Mary. You can say no.
Well, exoplanets, I don't know about exoplanets, but extraterrestrials, UFO abductions, contact, and that sort of thing. So what's interesting is that at least the lore, the anecdotes that you hear from people who claim that they've been in contact or had some kind of contact, something, almost all of it is described in terms of telepathy. They're not talking to something, but there's some kind of mental communion going on. And most people then will also say, well, it's something to do with consciousness. Even people who don't even do research or think about consciousness very much, they still come down basically to the same idea, that it's somehow the consciousness of us and whatever that is interacting in some way. My personal opinion on all of this is that what we're dealing with is not new. So I know Jacques Vallée pretty well, and Jacques, of course, is of the opinion that these kinds of contacts have been going on throughout recorded history. And in other times and places, they've been called fairies, and they've been called brownies and sprites and all kinds of things. And there are also a lot of cases of what today we would call a UFO, like the miracle at Fatima in Portugal. There are many, many instances like this in the historical record that suggests that whatever is going on here is not new. It's interpreted always in terms of the present day culture. And it's real in the sense of the imaginal world being real. And I say that because it's like UFOs behave in ways that we don't think physical objects can behave, at least in our current level of understanding. maybe in the future we'll find a way to make something go way too fast and take a right turn, and somehow that can happen. But because these things have been reported for so long, it kind of suggests that there's a blurring between physical and imaginal. And so the term imaginal world is sometimes used as a way of then saying, well, their mind and matter have a meeting point, and the meeting point is not completely material and it's not completely mental either. It's somewhere in between. So there seems to be a realm where things just are. And people taking psychedelics will talk about this, the same thing, because that's what they experience.
You're pretty much quoting Bernardo Kastrup in several of his books. That's his line. That there's a subjective and an objective world which both exist, and the subjective world is not necessarily constrained by the same constraints as the objective.
Yeah, and so part of this also comes out of the idea that if we take the Aristotle's law of the excluded middle, that's just not good enough to explain what's going on here, right? I mean, you see that immediately in quantum mechanics when you start talking about superpositions. A superposition is not yes or no. It's like everything all at once. This is why quantum computers are so powerful. And we need to think in more expansive terms about basic logic questions.
Indeed. Joanne Davis asked rather a good question here, I think. She picks up the fact that you weren't very happy to define energy, what exactly is energy, and that's a good point. But if we have a study of mediums, don't we have to, I mean, in the sort of spiritual medium-y world, people do often talk about energy. And do we need a definition of energy before we can work out what mediums are doing, I think is her question. I mean, are there different kinds? Is there a spiritual energy and a physics energy, which are different things? Or do you have any idea about that?
So, and likewise, we use the terms energy medicine. It's not energy as a physicist knows. And we often find that healers will talk about things in terms of vibration and frequency, and those, which is not what physicists think about in terms of frequency and vibration. So the way I put it is that the energy that we're talking about in this realm is felt energy. It's an internal feeling sense that feels in a way that we would describe as energetic. So I've had experiences with really exceptional body workers who do things like Qigong and other kinds of Eastern energetic body work. And I've felt extremely strong feelings of something that feels a lot like energy happening and moving in the body and all of that. And I remember at the time in one session that I felt something like around the solar plexus, that something opened. And there's this huge amount of energy pouring into me in some kind of vortex feeling. That's the image and the feeling that I had. And my scientist hat is still on always, even though it's occasionally goes away when I sleep, I think. But otherwise, I was thinking during that time, having this experience, that if I had a magnetometer and it was like I could sort of put it around my body, that it must show something. The problem is that we've used magnetometers and electrometers and lots of other instruments during sessions where people are having these kinds of experiences, and we don't pick up anything. We pick up nothing. So that means that the felt energy is something which is different in kind than at least the four forces that we think about in terms of physics. It's something else. It's real. I mean, it feels real and it has real physiological consequences in the body, but it's something else. So that's why I get stuck when I say, well, what is it? I don't know what it is. We see the effects of it, but we don't know what it is.
Well, someone you'll be pleased to know, Teresa, has asked a question which is a bit less in the head, more practical. People not living in the United States, are we able to get involved in any of your studies? I know you have international contacts.
Yes. So because of COVID, our laboratory and our retreat center has been shut down for over a year now. We're coming up on a year. We don't know when it's going to reopen. So we're retooling to do more studies that are online. So we've already, in past years, we already have done studies online. You go to a website and you do some kind of experiment online.
The IONS website.
Yes. Yeah. So, and Rupert Sheldrake has a number of online studies as well, including on smartphones, and we're beginning to do that as well. So that's the way that people can participate in our studies now. It's either on demand, you go to a website or you go to a smartphone and you do something, or we're beginning to look at possibility of Zoom studies as well.
Okay, so I mean, it's a matter of, as usual nowadays, keeping an eye on the right websites and seeing what comes up.
Yeah.
I suppose.
Yeah. So we don't have anything that is, I mean, we have a long term now. We've had the site called gotpsi.org, gotpsi.org. So that site I created in the year 2000, and it's running continuously since then. And we have at this point about 250 million trials from about 1/3 people around the world every single day. And so I'm in the process of analyzing those data, and we're finding all sorts of interesting results because we have gigantic databases. So that will continue, and it's we're putting out a new version, because when I wrote that in 2000, it ran for 20 years without any change at all, which is really good from the point of view of having a uniform database over long periods of time. It's not so good because the internet world changes very quickly. And so when I originally wrote this, I spent 6 months of the development at the time to prevent people from cheating. Because you know, the moment you do anything online that involves any kind of test or anything, there's always somebody who's going to try to hack it. So we spent a huge amount of time and continually over 20 years to prevent new methods of hacking. So we've just done a completely rewrite of the whole thing. It looks the same, but behind the scenes, it's totally different. They keep up to date to prevent people from cheating on it. And of course, even then, if you're a really determined hacker, you could cheat on anything, as we now know, but we have ways of detecting whether the data looks right.
Gosh, yes. So problems I wasn't expecting. You have enough problems anyway with this material. But
Hackers.
George asked the question, do we have evidence that groups of people who are in sync and are doing PK have better results than individuals?
We do not.
Oh.
And it's partially because getting a group of more than one person to do anything in complete sync is very, very difficult. And so to get back to magic for a second, I think one of the reasons why rituals, why ceremonial magic is front and center in a lot of magical practice is precisely to get people to be in sync. It's to like get your analytical side of your head out of the way, and you're doing exactly the same thing with other people involving chanting or movement or whatever it happens to be, because it is very difficult to get people on the same wavelength. So the metaphor that I use here is when a person is doing some kind of intentional experiment, it is as though you're creating a soap bubble. It's a very fragile thing, but it's a real structure. It's like a thought form, but like a soap bubble, it's also it's very fragile. It's brittle. You have two people trying to create the same soap bubble. Occasionally, they'll be so much in sync with each other that they can do that, but it's hard to sustain. You get 10 people, it's almost impossible to form the soap bubble, because the moment that everybody's together, one person's thinking this isn't going to work and it breaks. So about the closest we've seen this is in groups that have been doing meditations together with each other for a very long period of time, because then the group drops into the same mental state. And so we did a study once at the headquarters of the Transcendental Meditation movement, which is in Fairfield, Iowa. And they have these domes there where all the men would go in one dome and the women would go in another dome, and you'd hold 500 or more people in the dome at the same time. And they would all do meditations at the same time. So you have people over long periods of time, hundreds, doing the same kind of meditation, same place, the same time, same people. And we ran a random number generator during those sessions to see if we'd see anything. We got ridiculously good results, like so good that it looks like basically this is impossible. So you can get, occasionally, you can get that kind of effect. And unfortunately, when you get results that are so strong, I'm talking like 5 and 6 sigma variations from chance, you don't even sometimes want to publish it, because even your colleagues will look at that and say, this is ridiculous, this can't happen, it's too big compared to what we generally see in the laboratory. On the other hand, it does happen. So big things can definitely happen, but it's relatively rare to see it under well-controlled conditions. And that's why I think that even in the magical practice domain, if you have long-term groups doing the same rituals again and again, you can have some pretty amazing things happen. but they're not going to talk about it, partially because part of the magical context is you don't talk about Fight Club, basically. You know about the movie Fight Club, where the first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. Well, the same is true in magical practice. We have a very effective magical team. The first rule of the magical team is you don't talk about the magical team. And the second rule is you don't talk about the magical team. And every other rule beyond that is you don't talk about this.
Yes, that makes it more difficult, I agree. A slightly different topic. Suzanne Taylor said that she'd once hosted a healer and he did a lot of patients with her, and she and the patients all felt a sort of sizzle off his hands, but none of them got any healing. So everybody's feeling energy. I mean, a lot of people today feel some energy, and then nothing happens by way of the healing. Would you have a comment on that? That's the sort of energy question.
It may depend on the need for healing. Like if there were 100 people and each one had a very different need for healing, maybe it doesn't work that well. Or maybe it takes 3 months in order for the healing to show up. Or maybe their actual need for healing was too mild and they actually didn't have much of a need for healing. So one of the problems that we discovered was that I used a subtle energy healing device that was supposed to resolve pain. And we got a bunch of people to come in and their pain level was at 3 on average. Well, that's, it's annoying, but level 3, a lot of people just live with that and it's no big deal. So we saw an effect, but we saw a very small effect with that. So if you come in with somebody who is like a 9 on a 10 scale, they are absolutely dead centered. That is what they need. Well, that probably would respond better, depending on the nature of it. So if you have something like pain that is bone on bone, that's probably not going to work too good because that's not going to go away. I mean, in miraculous cases sometimes, but other kinds of healing that involve things like nerve pain and that sort of thing, that probably would respond better depending on the nature of the pain and the need of resolving it.
I mean, I suppose what you're saying, and are too polite to say, if I can say it for you to Suzanne, that her experience, no one's denying it, but the fact is it wasn't a scientific experiment. It wasn't controlled in any way. So we don't know some of the crucial facts. I suppose that's always going to be a comeback. Lots of us have personal experiences of various kinds like that, but there's no way we can really draw solid conclusions from that without something further being done.
Very difficult to draw any conclusions from anecdotal responses or anecdotal stories. On the other hand, it's the anecdotal stories that drive the experiments that we actually do.
Yes.
Right. So without those personal reports, we wouldn't have anything to study. So they're very important, but it's very different when we bring that into the laboratory. As
we draw to a close, you'll be interested to know that a couple of people are interested. One of them, at least, is a synesthete. What color this talk is?
What is it?
I had last silence, Judy. What color is this talk? Does anybody else? Someone suggests it looks orange.
Well, that could be because my shirt is sort of that color. But if I had to guess a color associated, it would be green.
Okay.
So I don't know if you knew or not, but my first career, so to speak, was being a violinist. Played the violin for 20 years. And I'm not a natural synesthete, but I developed it over the course of playing for many years. And so the open strings of a violin had very clear colors associated with them. And I could tune the violin by the color. And so it was annoying in a sense, because if I played in an orchestra and you tune initially, but if you're tuning from an oboe and the oboe's off a little bit, then it didn't feel right. The colors weren't right. You couldn't tune right. And because the pitch of the orchestra would drift over time, it's not good. And I don't have perfect pitch, but I have friends who had perfect pitch and they felt exactly the same way.
Wow.
They'd say, we're a quarter tone flat. It's horrible feeling when that's happening. So I have a bit of experience in music and color matching, and I can still evoke that. If I think about it for a while, I can still get the colors associated.
Yeah. You would not regard that as a psychic ability?
No, it's a connectome in the brain, is a little bit richer in one direction than another. I think that's what's going on.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dean. I mean, I've got lots of people saying what an excellent talk and how wonderful that was, and it certainly was. And it's very kind of you to devote your lunchtime, as I can tell most people this is. If Dean hasn't had his lunch yet, most of us are about to go to bed, you know.
Yeah, well, I've discovered a long time ago that eating lunch before giving a talk, that's not a good idea.
So good. That's another thing. You know, I really hope we'll get you back, and it's very kind of you since you're so busy. And maybe one day we'll get you back to Edinburgh, which would have been such a great thing.
I would like to do that. Yes, I had a lot of fun in Edinburgh.
Okay. Well, I think this is the moment to say thank you very much and goodbye and good night to everybody. And this has been absolutely great. Thanks everyone for coming. And Pauline has put the appropriate email address for the Noetics outfit on the chat there, so you can see that. And of course, we at the Arthur Conan Doyle Center have a lot of this information ourselves. So if you want to pursue Dean and you know, email and websites and his books are not enough, we've probably got some way of moving it forward. Anyway, we'll see you all again perhaps next week when we have another wonderful talk. And later on, perhaps we'll get Dean back again. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
And good night.